Hello, Jerez, and today we're going to be talking about Section 5 for Dia belonging again 2.1 on Ivan Illich, Ironies of Comfort, and Unfree Time, and we're going to be focusing on mainly the ideas of the tools of conviviality and useful unemployment. And it starts, Illich tells us this: money devalues what it cannot measure, and that means money suggests what it cannot buy is that which doesn't really matter, perhaps contributing to the loss of social capital and social gatherings, and yet the unpriced might be what matters most of all. Now, belonging again to 1 is going to make arguments that it is the space outside of economics that makes possible the creation of wealth, the intrinsic motivation that helps us flatten business cycles, things like that, of which keeps the market from falling into stagnation or becoming reliant on the stimulation of growth, which can result in, say, an increase of assets over wages to afford it, which could lead to income inequality and so on and so forth, or disparity. And so there's always this kind of interesting thing where, kind of thinking like Kurt Gödel, there's an argument to be made that economics is fundamentally incomplete. Now, that doesn't mean it's necessarily bad, because everything is fundamentally incomplete. Ultimately, a lot of belonging again wants to argue that everything comes down to a human element, a human contingency, which means it's on us. We can't just assume that a system is going to work on its own. Now, yeah, you got laws of large numbers, you've got probabilities and things like that. But even if there's a sense in which GDP increases in capitalism, just given the law of large numbers or something like that, the quality of that GDP may shift. It may become reliant on, say, it may mostly be concentrated in the hands of people who own equities, for example, or who own apartments or, real estate, and that should be taken into consideration. And ultimately, if you do not have wealth created to back up whatever increases in, say, GDP you have, you could be creating very, very large bubbles that could be very problematic. And whether or not those bubbles are justified by actual wealth creation, I think there's an argument to be made that requires these spaces outside of the market where people can generate motivation, ideas, creativity, Nietzschean childhood, artifactionism, etc., so forth, that we talk about in OG Rose. And if that space outside the market is not allowed to exist, then that could be at the expense of the market, which of course means the market could have a self-effacing tendency of devaluing what is not included in the market, and yet what is not included in the market is necessary. The book makes a distinction between discourse and rhetoric. I spoke with Guy Senstock about this, and we could say that the difference between rhetoric and discourse, the rising of rhetoric over discourse, is extremely dependent on what occurs in that space outside of the market. But if money has a tendency to devalue what it cannot pay for, as Mr. Illich tells us, that could be a problem. Which would suggest that the space in which the value of where money is backed by value, quote unquote, or wealth, could be the very space that money devalues. So there could be kind of a fundamental irony going on there. Ivan Illich is going to talk about something very interesting that I like, where he talks about the right to useful unemployment. And what that is the idea that if you're doing something outside of employment, like building a house, you should have a right to be able to do that. But what ends up happening is, Illich tells us, is that we end up being a deviant. We're seen as a deviant if we do something outside of the market. To quote from the text, to attempt to build a house or set a bone outside the control of certified specialist appears as an arnitic conceit. Furthermore, the man who produces his own housing is looked upon as a deviant who refuses to cooperate with the local pressure group for the delivery of mass-produced housing units. So what he's getting at is, he argues that there's a heavy reliance on the expert class, on technology, and market, money. And if you don't use the expert class, or you don't use technology, you're seen as there being something wrong with you. You're looked down upon, so you're a quote-unquote deviant. And so in trying to defend useful unemployment, what he's talking about is the idea that he's trying to defend a space where people don't have to be, the other key term, disabled. Because if in order to get food you require a food line or something, then there's a real sense in which you are disabled, because you can't hunt for yourself. You require the store. Now, this disablement is hidden from you, though, because if you have access to food line, then it doesn't seem like you're disabled at all. I mean, you can get food, right? So what ends up happening is you're disabled and you don't know it until the day comes where, you are forced to do something perhaps you didn't want to do, or you find yourself incapable of doing something you want to do, and it occurs suddenly and all at once. You find out you're disabled because now you can't access Food Lion or something like that, right? And I really like Ivan Illich here. We talked about this at the Parallax course, because Illich is kind of carving a space distinct from an Orwell and a Huxley. You're controlled not by, say, the oppression of the state or the pleasure of the market, but really simply by being disabled by goods and services. Now, hey, life is trade-offs. Just because you're disabled in X way, that may free you up to do something else. Like, you could argue we're disabled today by the printing press from memorizing long texts, or, like they did with the Torah or something like that. But that has arguably enabled us to be more creative, because we can free our brains up from memorizing everything. So it doesn't necessarily mean that disablement is bad in every single way. We just got to be aware of disablement so that we're not caught off guard. Also, there is this question of why capitalism may slip into stagnation, like a Tyler Cohn or even a Keynes argues. Now, Dietrich McCloskey doesn't like this thesis, but perhaps there is legitimacy to the stagnation if there's something about prosperity of which disables, and when we're disabled, we then prove incapable of avoiding stagnation. There could be something there where maybe the only way you avoid stagnation at that point is to rely on artificial intelligence, and then we would see why the logical end of capital is something like AI, just like you could argue Nick Land is putting forth. And I think also, like Illich says, one can see in this pattern, so kind of the patterns of prosperity, which he would argue are also against leisure and doing your own work. Leisure is this kind of Joseph Piper occupation of an alternative time that can be more creative. Mr. Illich would argue that the society is against that. And what he says is, in this, you see a reflection of the belief that useful activities by which people both express and satisfy their needs can be replaced indefinitely by standardized goods or services or by technology. So it's really kind of the idea that there's nothing that human beings need or want that cannot be serviced or replaced by an expert class or technology. And is that so? If it is not so, then we may find ourselves disabled and then say maybe in a meaning crisis or bored or something like that, and incapable of doing anything about it. And I am increasingly convinced, as we've talked about before, that the rat utopia experiment is really important, that there's something about prosperity that leads to kind of societies eating themselves, and maybe that's tied to the disablement that comes with prosperity. I'm not sure, but it needs to be thought of. And then the great Owen and Raymond talks about the loss of the thymotic. There seems to be something about disablement that destroys the thymotic, which then destroys social recognition, etc., and all of this is really consequential. I think what Illich is also wants to get at, which is very interesting. He ties this to the question of tools as well, our disablement, and being able to tell the difference between a tool that disables us versus one that services or serves conviviality, the ability for us to relate to one another as human beings, full human beings. You could think about the height. There's this kind of Hegel idea on the bondsman and the servant, the slave and the master, where the slave has all the power because the master can't do anything without the slave. Well, we can see that in operation with tools. So what would a tool be that doesn't disable us, that doesn't leave us incapable of doing anything? There's this lovely line where Illich writes, people need not only to obtain things, they need above all the freedom to make things among which they can live, to give shape to them according to their own tastes, and to put them in use in caring for and about others. Prisoners in rich countries often have access to more things and services than members of their families, but they have no say in how things are to be made and cannot decide what to do with them. Their punishment consists in being deprived of what I shall call conviviality. They are degraded to the status of mere consumers. So what Illich is getting at is that someone in prison is in prison because all they can do is consume. They have no agency. What is given to them, they cannot control. Yeah, sure, they have food and shelter and all that, but none of the world around them incubates conviviality at all, disables them. So again, on that rat experiment, the rat utopia experiment, John Calhoun maybe or something, his experiment, what you see is that the modern world creates a world where we have everything we could want, but it becomes a prison in a weird way. Because it destroys conviviality, the ability to relate to other people. Because I definitely think that the ability of humans to relate to one another convivially or to use technology as tools that extend our humanity versus replace it, that has a lot to do with how we use our time outside of work, our time energy, or if we even have time energy, as David will talk about at Theory Underground. And if we're not, say, reading philosophy of the humanities or enabling ourselves outside of the market, well, then we lack the capacities to use our tools versus used by them. We lose capacities for conviviality, which then probably destroys the social order. And it also probably, ironically, in the name of productivity and growing the GDP, result in the stagnation of the GDP and productivity. So there's a great irony there. Illich writes, the crisis can be solved only if we learn to invert the present deep structures of tools. If we give people tools that guarantee their right to work with high independent efficiency, thus simultaneously eliminating the need for either slaves or masters and enhancing each person's range of freedom. People need new tools to work with rather than tools that work for them. So we need tools with which we can work versus tools that replace our work, because that runs the risk of turning us into slaves. This makes me think of the great Carl Hayden Smith's work on hyperhumanism versus transhumanism. He gave a wonderful presentation at the Nietzsche conference about this, and there's a lot of work going on right now at Philosophy Portal. The monthly events have been tremendous. Carl's presented at that as well, and I highly suggest signing up for it all. But we can think of hyperhumanism as tools that extend humanity, while transhumanism, as defined here, replaces our humanity. So what Carl Hayden Smith is talking about is tools of conviviality, AI of conviviality, these kind of things. And we really have to make sure our technology is in service of that conviviality. Because if we simply ask, does it work? Then we may not pay attention to if it works without us. And if it works without us, then it won't be long before we feel like we're not needed. And when that occurs, then it makes sense that you would have a meaning crisis. Illich writes, I choose the term conviviality to designate the opposite of industrial productivity. I intended to mean autonomous and creative intercourse among persons, and the intercourse of persons with their environment. I believe that in any society, as conviviality is reduced below a certain level, no amount of industrial productivity can effectively satisfy the needs it creates among society's members. At which point we could be very prosperous, we could have all the GDP we could ever imagine, and yet we won't be able to meet one another in our human needs for friendship, for community, for conviviality, for depth. And at that point, it's no surprise that something like the Rat Utopia experiment seems to be prophetic. For more by OG Rose, please visit ogrose.com, Twitter, Anchor, Instagram, so on and so forth. And thank you so much for your time.